Welcome to History 361, History of Germany. This is Module 2. In this module, we're going to look at the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Reformation, or what is sometimes called the Counter-Reformation. We're going to look at it principally from German-speaking countries, realms, from also Switzerland, which would have been part of the Habsburg realms at one point in time. And then we're just having one slide on the Protestant Reformation in England so that you can compare and contrast it with the German Protestant Reformation, and one slide on the Reformation in France, which of course spilled over with the Calvinists into the German realms. The most important movers and shakers of the Protestant Reformation. His name was Martin Luther, and he was born in Eisleben in Germany in 1483. His father was a miner. That is, he was a coal miner. And so his father really wanted a better life for Martin than he had had for himself. So he scrimped and saved to give Martin, his son, a Latin education. And a Latin education in those days meant that probably Martin would go on to be one of two things, either a lawyer or a priest, because those were the most educated people in society at that time. There were many people out there who were uneducated and who were farmers and had no reason for, the vast majority of people were farmers. They had no reason to be educated. Well, eventually, the family moved to Mansfeld in Germany. And in 1505, Luther was caught in a violent thunderstorm. Lightning struck very close to him and threw him to the ground. In terror, he called out to St. Anne, the patron saint of the coal miners of Mansfeld, and promised to become a monk if he would live through this horrible thunderstorm. Now, even back in those days, people in the church would have told Martin Luther, don't worry about that vow that you made to God, because vows that you make under such stressful circumstances, under duress, are not binding. You don't have to follow through on them. But Martin was the kind of person who was always very compulsive, very scrupulous. And he felt that he needed to follow through on this. The problem was that Martin's father, Hans, the coal miner, never wanted his son to become a priest, to become a monk. He wanted his son to become a lawyer. Some say that Martin would see God initially, not later, the way he saw his father, as a person with great expectations, and a person that if you didn't meet their expectations might punish you. A later philosopher and writer, some of you may have heard of him, Kierkegaard, wrote of Martin Luther that Luther always, quote, spoke and acted as if lightning were about to strike behind him the next moment, end quote. Well, that's his opinion, and that's probably not at all a fair analysis. What we do know about Martin Luther is he was an extremely intelligent person. He received his doctorate in theology from the University of Wittenberg in Saxony in Germany. We didn't actually have a Germany at that time. It was called the Holy Roman Empire. And there, until the end of his life, he spent his time teaching at the University of Wittenberg, where he became a professor of Holy Scriptures, and he was a very popular professor. His students loved him, loved his lectures, and he also served as a priest at the local church in Wittenberg. He was a very popular preacher, very learned, very respected. People just loved him. Well, where Martin Luther kind of began to disagree with the Catholic Church of the time and to begin what the world calls in world history, the Protestant Reformation, was over what were called indulgences. Now, indulgences are a very complicated thing theologically. So I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to explain those as if we're all going to understand that, because that's not the case. We're going to kind of give you a more superficial explanation and say that that's going to have to suffice, because we've got 8 weeks to do all of world history since 1500. An indulgence is, according to the Church, Catholic Church, the remission of the temporal punishment due to sin, not a remission of sin itself. And it's based upon the fact that Jesus Christ and the saints in the Church's view are so holy that we as sinners can call upon their holy works, their good works, and ask literally their indulgence with God and in our own temporal punishment that the Church said at that time one would have to undergo for one's sins. And the Church in those days believed in purgatory, which would be a place that many ordinary people would go after they died. It would be a place of purgation, literally purging one's sins after death, a temporary stop, so to speak, on the way to heaven. And so if one's loved ones had died, then you might say prayers and do certain good works and acts which could help your loved ones through indulgence to draw upon the holy works of others and get them to heaven sooner and more quickly. Now, the problem was that in 1507, Pope Julius II, the Pope of the time, declared an indulgence. And this indulgence was meant partly to be sold, and the sales of this were to actually go towards the building of the new St. Peter's, which, of course, was being built in Rome at that time to replace the rather old St. Peter's. So we introduce a couple of people, Martin Luther, Pope Julius II, and now we're going to introduce a third person, Albert of Brandenburg. Albert of Brandenburg was from a very powerful family politically in Germany, in the Holy Roman Empire at the time. And in 1513, he had become Archbishop of Magdeburg, Bishop of Halberstadt, and in 1514, he was appointed Archbishop and Elector of Mainz. He literally became one of the 7 or so most important people in the Holy Roman Empire, what we now call kind of Germany, Austria-Hungary, when he became Elector of Mainz, because there were only 7 or so electors of the Holy Roman Emperor. So he was tremendously politically important. Now, back in those days, Germany was divided up into many small bishoprics, dioceses headed up by bishops, archdioceses headed up by archbishops, principalities headed up by princes, duchies headed up by dukes, and they were all under the kind of rather loose control in terms of foreign affairs of the Holy Roman Emperor, but they all held a good deal of local and regional autonomy on their own. So it was not at all uncommon for religious officials to be both religious leaders, as Albert of Brandenburg was, as well as simultaneously political leaders. Albert of Brandenburg owed a lot of money to the Fuggers, who were German bankers. They were from the city of Augsburg, and they were the bankers for the Vatican, for the Pope in Italy. And they were to handle the sales of these indulgences on commission, and they agreed in that area to divide the sales up, the income from those sales, between the Pope and between Albert of Brandenburg. So we've got Albert of Brandenburg over in Brandenburg, which is a neighboring province to Saxony, where Martin Luther is. Martin Luther's in Saxony, and Martin Luther's ruler, he earned the term of Frederick the Wise. He ruled the area where Martin Luther was in Saxony, and he decided he did not approve of the sale of the indulgences because he did not want to enrich his neighbor, Albert of Brandenburg. Well, as things would happen, a Dominican monk by the name of John Tetzel came by into the area of Albert of Brandenburg and began to sell the indulgences. Now, this would have been sort of like Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky, or say Chicago and East Chicago and the Indiana suburbs of Chicago, or St. Louis and the Illinois suburbs of St. Louis, etc., or New York and New Jersey suburbs. That's all that people in Saxony from Wittenberg had to do, is just go right next door to Albert of Brandenburg's land and buy their indulgences. And then they would come back to Martin Luther, and they misunderstood what they bought. They thought the indulgence forgave their sins. So they would go to him in confession and say, I've got an indulgence, my sins are forgiven. And he would say, that's not what that means. You misunderstand what an indulgence is, etc. And so he's disturbed by all of these misunderstandings. And on October 31st, 1517, which, ever since Protestant churches celebrate October as Reformation month, and that October, the Sunday closest to October 31st, as Reformation Sunday, Luther affixed 95 theses talking about indulgences. It was written in Latin, and he affixed it to the door of the church at Wittenberg. Now, this was something common. The church doors in towns all across Europe at this time functioned like our internet does today, or like a big bulletin board. This is where you would post things that would be of interest, and he was debating, and he said, I have 95 ideas, 95 theses on this whole idea of the sale of indulgences. But Luther then sent, in addition, his 95 theses to the Archbishop of Mainz, who was Albert of Brandenburg. And Albert of Brandenburg said, I don't like what this guy Martin Luther's saying, because he's saying stuff that might affect the sale of the indulgences. And so Albert of Brandenburg reported Martin Luther to Rome. He denounced him to Rome. Father Tetzel and other people reported on Luther to Rome as well. And in the interim, Luther's popularity began to spread among the people. And Luther largely earned that popularity, by the way, by using a very new form of media, the printing press. And Luther decided that in, the printing press, which was a new technology, much like, the internet is to our world, the printing press was brand new to the world of Martin Luther. But he didn't print whole entire books, because ordinary people could have never afforded whole entire books. He printed little pamphlets that explained his kind of theology. And he printed thousands of these things. We know that between 1518 and 1524, that the number of between Luther's 30 writings, between 1517 and 1520, were distributed in more than 300,000 copies. And some of those pamphlets reached 15 and 18 different editions. One could literally think, as an author has said, that nearly every German was reading Martin Luther's pamphlets. And what did he say in some of his pamphlets? Well, he came up with what is really known in the Protestant churches, especially in the Lutheran Church founded by Luther, in the three alone statements. The first is grace alone. Martin Luther claimed that grace was a free gift of God. You could not earn it. That we are saved as humans, Martin Luther said, by God's grace alone. We can't earn it. Good works are important, but you can do good works until the cows come home, Martin Luther would say, and I'm paraphrasing him, obviously he didn't say that, and still not work your way into heaven, that you are saved as a human being, Martin Luther said, by the free gift of God, by grace alone. The second thing that Martin Luther said is that human beings are saved because they have faith, they have trust in God's mercy. And the third thing he would say is that the foundation of all of the things that Christians believed were in the Bible, that the Bible was the source, the norm of the Christian's faith life, not all of the traditions and so forth and rules and regulations that were handed down over the centuries by church authorities, which Martin Luther saw as just kind of, in some cases, helpful additions, but in some cases, not very helpful additions or accretions. And if you see in these three alone statements, if we think about these critically, what these are going against is the whole idea of purgatory and the whole idea of indulgences. You know, that good works, whether they be buying indulgences or praying certain prayers or whatever, are all good and nice, but cannot save you. Now, this is very important because he's establishing a theology, and he's doing it kind of right off the bat. The other thing that we kind of recognize the Protestant Reformation about, and there are, again, people who write on the pro side of this, there are people who write on the con side of this, but no matter how you look at it and how you look maybe at that time period, is as Protestantism developed over the centuries in sort of parallel with some new developments in politics, what was really developing in Europe at that time was individualism. And individualism can partly, not solely, certainly Martin Luther is not responsible 100% for individualism in our society, but he's partly responsible. His theology is partly responsible because what he was really calling for was the breakdown of the hierarchy of the church as he saw it. Again, he said that the most important thing was the Bible, that everyone needed to read the Bible, that everyone needed to interpret the Bible, that in essence every Christian believer was a priest. And he would, of course, later on attack the idea of having a pope and so forth. So he was attacking that hierarchical structure of the church. He was also believing that grace did not have to be distributed through the hands of a select group of people, namely priests. So Luther denied 4 of the original 7 sacraments of the church and really only accepted 3 of the sacraments. So he was also talking about a breakdown not only in hierarchy, but a breakdown in doctrine. And then some people took it to the next step and said, if no pope, maybe no bishop. If no bishop, no king, no prince, no duke, etc. Now this is where people took the reality of what Martin Luther was said and they put their own spin on it. They began to read into things, into Martin Luther, things that he never said, things that he never meant. But again, that's the way we as human beings work. We hear one thing, we switch it around, we change it to what we want to hear, and in some respects, the princes and the dukes and other secular leaders of the time in the Holy Roman Empire just latched onto this and extended it into political thought as well. Luther ended up recognizing 3 sacraments: baptism, Eucharist, and penance. So, well, what do we know about Luther at this point? Well, we know that the Pope was not pleased. And in June of 1520, he issued a papal document, what's called a papal bull, B-U-L-L, or document, ordering Luther to recant what he had said in 60 days' time. That is literally to take back, to apologize for it, and to say, I was wrong. And in the interim, all of Martin Luther's writings were to be burned. Obviously, they couldn't get a hold of all, 300,000 copies, so they did that symbolically. Luther did a remarkable thing. He decided to burn the papal bull. And so actually a new final bull of papal excommunication arrived in January of 1521. Excommunication in those days meant that you were literally cut off from the church. You were seen as a heretic. You could not receive the sacraments unless you recanted, unless you did penance, unless you reformed yourself. And to be cut off from the church in those days, where the church, religion was a much more powerful thing in people's everyday life than it is really for us today. Well, the head of all of this is Charles V, who's Holy Roman Emperor. He's the titular head of everything in Germany and Austria and Hungary. He's the titular head of all of those dukes and bishops and archbishops and princes and so forth that operate the hundreds of provinces in this very disconnected Holy Roman Empire. And he decides he's got a problem on his hands. And he better do something about it, because it could get out of hand, and sometimes these religious reformations would turn into political kinds of reformations and could be very dangerous to him and to others. Charles V reigned for a long time as Holy Roman Emperor, from 1519 to 1556. So he called together an imperial diet. A diet isn't where you lose weight. The diet in the Holy Roman Empire was the assembly. So he called together an imperial diet, an imperial assembly at the city of Worms. And I am pronouncing this correct, and W's in German are pronounced as V's. Okay, Luther was assured safe passage to and from Worms. Okay, so they said, we're not going to harm you. Just show up at Worms. We want to talk to you. And, of course, they expected him to show up at Worms, and they wanted him to recant, to take back everything he said, but he refused. He refused to recant. He stuck to his guns. He stuck to his principles. He left Worms in April 1521, and already people were worrying for his life. Frederick the Wise, his ruler in Saxony, secreted Luther off to a castle at Wartburg for safekeeping. And on May 8th, the imperial cabinet of the Diet of Worms issued an edict called the Edict of Worms. It branded Luther literally as a devil in the habit of a monk, declared him a criminal in the Holy Roman Empire, and basically called for him to be turned over and his life to be taken. Luther was safe at Wartburg under the protection of Frederick the Wise. And Luther, just to show you how great of a scholar he was, translated the Bible into German when he was at Wartburg. He finished the New Testament in 1522 and the Old Testament later on, after he had left Wartburg in 1534. An amazing thing. The Bible had really only been available in Latin. So only the Bibles were very expensive. Only the very educated people, the lawyers and the priests could read the Bible. The common people who knew German but had not been educated in Latin could not read the Bible. So by Luther translating the Bible into German, the common people's language, this was very important for the growth of individualism, because now individuals who weren't all that educated could begin to read these new Bibles that would be printed by the printing press and become less expensive in German. And Luther and others promoted literacy. They promoted people learning how to read so that they could read the Bibles. See how important this was to the growth of individualism, to having people learning to read. People learning to read would become people who were educated, who would become, maybe establish a whole different society. Well, meanwhile, poor social conditions in Germany had led to widespread peasant revolts, literally a peasants' war of 1524 to 26. And although the war had its roots in economic and social conditions, the peasants took these new religious ideas of Luther and embedded them into the rebellion. And by late April of 1525, 300,000 peasants were under arms. In the early phase of the war, the peasants looked to Luther for support, but Luther was absolutely struck by panic at the violence. And he even admonished the princes to end the revolution through a bloodbath. He basically said, I didn't mean my thoughts to be used politically in a war, in a rebellion. And the princes of Germany did end the war very violently. About 100,000 peasants died during the course of the Peasants' War. What Luther perhaps was realizing by this time, and other people were realizing as well, as you can write whatever you write, but once you open the door just a little, as Dr. Tenkate always says, you can never really shut it again. Once you open the door just a little bit, you can't really shut it again. And furthermore, you have no control over how people interpret your writings. Well, Luther continued. He went back to Wittenberg. He taught at the university until his death with a few interruptions. He married an ex-nun, and he and his wife had 6 children of their own, and they raised 11 orphan children. And he died of stroke in 1546. Well, what happened to Germany? Germany, as we said, broke out. It was very fragmented. It was ripe for change. To call the Holy Roman Empire, or Germany at this time, a dinosaur, is a political dinosaur, is kind of a meaningful analogy. Germany was composed of 300 plus different political subdivisions, principalities, duchies, bishoprics, archbishoprics. We've said it again and again, even free imperial towns, territorial towns. It was really an aberration, a political backwater of Europe, of petty principalities, a political dinosaur in modern European times. And it was this dinosaur just when nation states were developing throughout the rest of Europe. Perhaps Martin Luther expressed it best when he stated of Germany, quote, "Germany is a beautiful, strong horse with food and everything she needs, but she lacks a rider," end quote. The Reformation really epitomized the final and most violent struggle that would occur in this time period between church and state. And Germany broke out into religious warfare between Catholic political leaders, princes on the one hand, and Protestant ones on the other. This was called the Schmalkaldic War, and it broke out in 1546. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, was Catholic, and he supported the Catholic political leaders, princes. And the Catholics in Charles V won, but they did not win decisively. And so the status quo basically was continued. Fighting broke out again in the early 1550s. And Charles V became very disillusioned. He abdicated the throne, divided up his kingdom, as we'll later see, between his brother on the one hand and his son on the other hand. And this latest round of fighting would be actually finished a year before he abdicated. And but it's one of the things that led him in 1556 to abdicate. But anyhow, in 1555, the Peace of Augsburg was settled, and it had two principal terms. It established, number one, the principle in Latin, and I'm not trying to be pedantic, it's usually given in textbooks as this, cuius regio, eius religio, which means whose region, his religion. So, if you found yourself in Saxony, which was ruled by a Protestant prince, and you were Protestant, you were fine. If you were Catholic, well, you probably should really move out of Saxony and move, to Brandenburg, which was Catholic. And vice versa. If you were Protestant in Brandenburg, then you needed to move. So people literally were starting to move around to specific regions where the princes, the leaders, were of the same religion. Secondly, no form of Protestantism other than Lutheranism was to be tolerated in Germany. Well, Germany wasn't the only place that was experiencing reforms in the church. In Switzerland, Ulrich Zwingli, who was a Catholic priest, began preaching Protestant doctrines in the city of Zurich by 1519. And by this time, Switzerland had pretty well asserted its virtual independence from the Holy Roman Empire and from the church-wise from the Pope. It formed itself, Switzerland, into 13 cantons or provinces, which became a union called the Swiss Confederation. Zwingli very much proposed the fusion of church and state into a single community, the faithful, in the city of Zurich. He literally set up in the city of Zurich what we call a theocracy, where morality became law, and law was morality. You didn't have a division between church and state. And Zwingli's church-state city warred against the Catholic cantons of Switzerland. So again, the Protestants were fighting the Catholics, and with Austria's help, which was of course Catholic, Zurich, the Protestant city, was defeated in 1531, and Zwingli was killed in combat. And then an amazing thing happened. The same thing has happened in Germany. In Switzerland, they decide that each one of these cantons or provinces could choose its own religion. It was going to be either Catholic or it was going to be Protestant. There were other reformers, Anabaptists, who became the predecessors of Baptists. And they practiced adult baptism, not infant baptism like the Catholic Church or the Lutheran Church. And furthermore, they were not predestinarian, and this is going to make more sense to you here in a minute when we discuss what predestination was. But unlike the Calvinists and John Calvin, who were predestinationists, the Anabaptists were not. And so a lot of people disliked the Anabaptists, including the Calvinists, and would persecute them. They also believed in the separation between church and state. They, for instance, refused to take oaths, civil oaths of any kind. They refused to take part in wars. Again, you can see what's happening here. This continuing movement towards individualism, this continuing movement towards a separation between church and state. And then there were other groups like Jakob Hutter and the Hutterites, Menno Simons and the Mennonites. There are still Mennonites who live throughout the world, and there are Mennonites in the United States, and sometimes you see them traveling about. They have a rather simple way to dress, and look to Scripture and live very kind of moral lives. And then there was John Calvin, who was born in 1509, and he's sort of the counterpart to Martin Luther, except that he was French and Martin Luther was German. In many ways, though, he was like Martin Luther. John Calvin was from a middle-class family, and he prepared for a theological career received a master's degree, and then instead of pursuing the priesthood, he changed to law to, guess what, please his father. And in 1532, he received his doctorate of law. And in 1533 or 34, he experienced, he said, a kind of personal conversion to Christianity. And in 1536, published the first edition of a book entitled The Institutes of the Christian Religion, for which John Calvin is most known. By 1536, he fled France because he wasn't welcome there anymore with his new views, and he reached Geneva in Switzerland. And then a couple years later, they asked him to leave Geneva in Switzerland because they didn't like his beliefs. And so eventually he went to Strasbourg, which is kind of right along the Rhine River on the border between what we now know to be Germany and France. It's now literally a part of France, Strasbourg. But the reason why a lot of people didn't like him and didn't want him around is that he preached something called predestination. Now, this was an ancient theological problem. And the problem emerges that if you hold as your assumption that God is all-knowing, then God would know everything. God would know who would be saved for heaven and who would be damned. So in essence, John Calvin said that God predestined us. We were predestined either for heaven or for hell. Now, again, we have to do all of world history since 1500 in 8 weeks. So if any of you want to discuss this idea further with me and what theologians have thought about it, actually I know quite a lot about this topic. I've read a lot about it. I've taken a lot of courses. But, you know, there were all kinds of answers to this problem. The simple answer, the simplest answer to give is that, you know, God lives in an eternity, that past, present, and future are all the same to him, that it's a human thing. It's only humans that live in past and present and future. And so that we cannot, with our little minds, begin to understand the eternal viewpoint of God. And so we just accept, the churches would say, the Lutheran Church, the Catholic Church, and others, just accept the fact that you have free will and you know, can decide if you want to follow God or not. But anyhow, John Calvin said that no, that human beings were predestined. Well, surprisingly, Geneva, things changed in Geneva, and Calvin was invited to return to Geneva in 1540, and there he set up another theocracy, you know, where morality becomes law and law is morality, and there's no real difference between church and state. The city of Geneva became what we would anachronistically call puritanical. You weren't allowed to dance, you weren't allowed to play cards, you weren't allowed to get drunk, use profanity. All of these things were literally outlawed in the secular laws as well as obviously the religious. Some who disagreed were exiled, and at least one heretic was condemned and burned for heresy. So everybody is kind of, you know, exiling and burning and killing heretics at this time period. In England, the Protestant Reformation took an entirely different twist. And whereas in Germany and France and Switzerland, the Protestant Reformation really started out and was strongly tied to religious reforms or new religious ideas, the English Reformation had in its beginnings not a religious reformation, as in Lutheranism or Calvinism, but rather in an affair of state, quite literally. King Henry VIII, with the sanction of Parliament and the agreement largely of the English people, simply cut the ties to the allegiances that bound the churches in England to the Pope in Rome. Literally, Henry made no significant doctrinal changes other than to say that he would henceforth be the head of the church in England. And people went along with it for the most part, not everyone, because Henry managed to make it kind of popular. He confiscated a lot of the vast lands that the churches, monasteries, and convents had owned, and he redistributed those to his favorites. But it all started out when King Henry VIII wanted an annulment from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Now this was a sticky wicket, because Catherine of Aragon was from the very famous Habsburg family, and she was related, obviously, to the Habsburgs, like Charles V, who was the very powerful emperor of Germany, of the Habsburg, the Holy Roman Empire. And it turns out that Catherine had been married before she married Henry to Henry's deceased brother, Arthur. And she was not producing an heir, a male heir for Henry at this point in time. So Henry supposedly, read the passage in the Bible where if you marry your brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. And he became convinced that he needed an annulment from his first wife. An annulment is different from a divorce. An annulment says that a marriage never occurred, that it was null and void from the start because of such and such a reason. What you need to know about the European rulers of the day is, number one, what Catherine did was just very, very ordinary. You kept these important positions of kings and queens and in these aristocratic and imperial families. So when Arthur, King Henry's brother, died, yeah, she was free to marry Henry, who became, Henry VIII. There was no reason why she couldn't do that. It's also, you should note, that annulments were a fairly convenient way for the European royalty to get, marriages that were no longer kind of politically useful anymore dissolved. Well, in the interim, Henry became infatuated with a woman in his royal court by the name of Anne Boleyn. And, Henry and Catherine had only had one child, Mary. She would later on become Bloody Mary. And he really did want a son, obviously. So Anne Boleyn became infatuated, or Henry became infatuated with her. She was the daughter of an ambitious man who had risen high in court circles, and the man wished his daughter Anne to become queen someday. So in 1527, Henry divorced Catherine and married Anne. He later, by the way, would have her beheaded, that is, Anne, for having no male children. No, he did nothing to Catherine of Aragon. She was much too powerful to behead or do anything nasty to. In that very same year, by the way, Charles V, in 1527, and his imperial troops had occupied the city of Rome and taken the weak Pope Clement VII, a virtual prisoner. So there was a lot of politics going along at the time. At least one person who was very powerful, probably the most powerful person next to Henry VIII in England, was Thomas More, chancellor and a lawyer and author of the great work called Utopia. And Thomas More refused to take the oath of succession, the oath of supremacy, recognizing Henry VIII as the supreme head of the Church of England. And that was considered treason, and for that fact he was executed. He was beheaded and recognized later on as by the Catholic Church as St. Thomas More. So the Church of England is now the thing. We call it in England the Anglican Church. In the United States, we would call it later on the Episcopal Church. So the Episcopal Church in America, the Anglican Church or Church of England in England, Church of Scotland as it's called in Scotland. It's the thing that is the major church in England after this point of time. Henry VIII had a son. He ended up having 6 wives, and he had a son, Edward VI, who ruled from 1547 to 1553, continued on supporting the Church of England, and then he died, and his sister, Mary Tudor, or Queen Mary I, came to the throne. She was the daughter of Catholic Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII. She was the daughter from the first marriage. And she turned England around and wanted to make it Catholic again and pursued some persecutions of Protestants, and hence Protestants called her Bloody Mary. She also got involved, as all of these monarchs, in continental European politics. And then eventually Queen Elizabeth, her half-sister, Mary's half-sister, would come to rule from 1558 to 1603 and return things kind of back to Protestantism, to the Church of England in England. Meanwhile, in France, the Calvinists, those who believed and followed John Calvin and practiced predestination, became known as Huguenots. These were Calvinists. They gained members in France. They began persecuting Catholic priests and nuns, sacking towns, collecting taxes, even minting their own coins. In other words, trying to assert their own rights. From 1559 until 1589, there essentially was 30 years of violence and civil war in France, much of it religious. Philip II of Spain aided the French Catholics. Queen Elizabeth of England supported French Protestants. Both sides used mercenary troops from Germany and Switzerland. So along comes Henry II, who ruled France from 1547 to 1559. His queen was Catherine de Medici, and they had 3 sons, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, and a daughter, Margaret of Valois. And the daughter married a Protestant nobleman, Henry of Navarre. The wedding between Protestant Henry of Navarre and Henry II's daughter provoked violence. The violence was actually sort of planned, some say, by Catherine de Medici, and led eventually to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, which was against Protestant. Some 12,000 Protestants died during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. So this is just one example of the kind of the 30 years of violence that was occurring in France during that time period, much of it religious. Well, in 1589, Henry III, the son of Henry II, was assassinated, and they ran out of sons here. All the sons were dead by that time. So Henry of Navarre, the son-in-law, right? The son-in-law became king. But remember, he became King Henry IV. He was Protestant. And at that point in time, the Valois dynasty of France came to an end, and the Bourbon dynasty began. And you might say, well, how do these dynasties begin and end, and why should I care? The dynasties sort of end when things like this happen, when instead of a direct descendant becoming king, an indirect descendant, say for instance the son-in-law, becomes king, and then a new dynasty emerges. Thankfully for all of you in World Civ, since 1500, the Bourbon dynasty would last until the time of the French Revolution, and then even after that they would bring it around. So let's talk about Henry IV, King Henry IV, Henry of Navarre, that son-in-law. Okay, in 1589 he became king, and he issued the Edict of Nantes, literally giving Protestants 150 areas, 150 strongholds throughout France, mainly in the southwest of France, and ensuring them liberty of worship within those areas. So he really wanted to end this violence, and in fact he did end the 30 years of religious violence with this edict. At the same time, he eventually would, not at the same time, but eventually he would convert to Catholicism some 4 years later. Some say that he made the statement that Paris was worth a mass. We don't know if that's true or not. Later on, he would annul his marriage to Margaret of Valois and marry Marie de Medici. And he himself would, in 1610, be assassinated by a fanatical Catholic. Well, how does all of this end? How does the Catholic Church respond to all of these changes, these allegations, and the literally the breakup of the church, the fragmentation of the church into new churches like the Lutheran Church and the Calvinists and so forth? Well, Pope Paul III, who reigned from 1534 to 449, appointed reforming cardinals and bishops to the church, and he appointed a commission to study the Catholic Church and to recommend reforms. Meanwhile, very important people like Ignatius of Loyola would begin their own reforms and founded a religious society of priests and brothers within the Catholic Church called the Society of Jesus. Today we know them as the Jesuits, and they run, one of the things they do is run marvelous institutions of higher learning. Georgetown University and Xavier University in Cincinnati and Fordham University and so many other places, Loyola University, etc. And so they became the very educated force which began to present the church and what it was saying to the people and to kind of gain some territory back from Protestants of the day. The Society of Jesus also became the priests and confessors to many of the royalty and nobility as well of Europe. Then in this commission, this Council of Trent that was called of bishops and cardinals and archbishops of the Catholic Church was held in 3 sessions between 1545 to 1563, and it did 3 very important things. It restated the basic doctrines of the Catholic Church, declaring that both Scripture and tradition were important. It reaffirmed belief in the 7 sacraments, and transubstantiation, meaning that in the Mass that the bread and wine became the body and blood of Jesus Christ, which some of the Protestant reformers were debating. And it also said that good works were important for one's salvation too. And it corrected some basic abuses. It required each diocese to set up a seminary for the training of priests so that Catholic priests would become very literate and very, church educated in theology. And it required bishops to reside, to live in their diocese so that they could keep a look on things and be good shepherds of their flock. So this is a tremendous time period. There's a lot of stuff that was happening. If you have any questions, please feel free to email or phone me. I'm always happy to help. Thank you.